I decided to write a book about consulting. I wrote Becoming an Enlightened Consultant. I wrote that book during the first quiet time in my life. I'd been working really hard for 40 years in the industry and got cancer. And I was able to use that period of time to step back from my career, look at what I've done, what I've enjoyed doing, what's worked, what hasn't worked. And I decided to write a book about consulting. And it's a blend of a book about consulting as well as personal opening and awakening and learning about myself and how I've performed in business and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I have a clearer picture of how to move forward in consulting because I'm not finished yet. I have a number of years of consulting ahead of me, and I'll be working in a very different way. I believe there's a transformation underway globally, and that transformation is beginning to shed inauthenticity. We've been dominated by, in business and consulting and in life, we've been dominated by a period of time where inauthenticity is dominant and it's causing some challenges. When I decided to write this book, part of the theme of this book is understanding the ego and the role that ego plays in business. The time I was able to step back and look at how I interact with people and how I've built businesses and bought and sold companies, how I've integrated teams, I learned a lot about how to interact with people better than I have in the past. So part of the learning that I've put into this book is about people. And really, consulting isn't that complicated. You know what your services are, you understand the market, you find a client, you create a project with that client, you deliver the project on time and on budget, and you find the next one. So consulting itself, the process of consulting, isn't that difficult. The challenging pieces of it are interacting with humans and spending time with people and trying to get them aligned with the work they're doing, get them excited and inspired about the work they're doing. There are some similarities, regardless of the size of the companies. There are similarities across the board. One of the commonalities or the similarities, the successful firms seem to be the ones where people aren't controlled and managed, but rather they're inspired and empowered. The teams that produce more naturally are the teams that are excited about what they do. They choose to be inspired and they want to find a way to help. So those projects, it doesn't matter really what kind of project it is, whether you're designing and building a bridge, or you're creating a new national park, or you're doing some biodiversity studies, each one of those projects has an opportunity for better outcomes. And the companies that understand that and are driven by inspired, visionary leaders are the ones that will succeed. The pace of change is quite dramatic these days, not just in consulting and work, but in life. The pace of change in the economy, the pace of geopolitical change is staggering. So how does a company, or how do leaders of a company manage that change? And how do they recognize the effects of that change on their teams? The answer to that question, I speak to quite a bit in the book I wrote about differentiation, how to deal with change and transformation, how to inspire people, and how to let teams work together more effectively. And part of the success of that is really grounded in understanding the ego. The ego is something I didn't know an awful lot about before I wrote this book. It was something I learned an awful lot about as I went through cancer and recovery. I was given the opportunity to consider and to observe how I behave and how I respond to my ego and how I observe my ego. So my book really talks about seeing yourself in a way that is more aware using self-awareness as a tool to improve consulting outcomes. I know that change can be challenging, but I also know personally that change can be very exciting. Managing that change and recognizing it for what it is and not being afraid of it can make a significant difference in business. And I think as we are able to recognize and release ourselves from those negative places, I believe that's where we can make change happen more effectively. So coming from a place of honesty, transparency, and positivity, being able to talk to team members honestly and openly about the challenges that they're facing on a project, in their lives, helping find solutions, helping guide people in a way that will allow them to find their own solutions. Those are characteristics that I've observed that I believe can be quite effective. Managing a team and inspiring a team can be challenging sometimes, especially in a period when the economy is tougher, when projects get more complicated, when they're not going as perfectly as you might hope they would. It's in those moments where we have the greatest opportunities for learning. Corporate environments are sometimes more rigid, driven by profit targets, by revenue targets, by billable hour targets. In consulting, that's very common. It's not always driven by wanting to achieve the best outcome. So the ability to see that and the ability to drive for the right outcomes while still managing a project capably and competently, that's what it takes in a transforming consulting industry. You know, the biggest challenge writing this book was partly that I was doing it while recovering from cancer. The doctors and healthcare practitioners thought I was odd because my hospital table at my bedside was covered in books and sticky notes and highlighter pens. And every day the doctors would come in and say, "What are you reading now, Mr. Hilditch?" And they were really intrigued by that. So part of the challenge for me was, it was cancer in my brain. They thought it was brain cancer initially. So they were trying to make sure that nothing was put at risk in the brain surgery I had and the chemo and radiation. So part of the challenge for me writing the book was making sure that my brain was still very active, high functioning, that I could read and digest 60 or 70 books and understand what I was trying to express. So part of the challenge for me was I did it at probably the lowest point of my physical health that I've been in. So it was a challenge, but to me it was also an exciting opportunity because I showed myself that our bodies and our minds are incredibly resilient. If given the opportunity, we can do anything. As I was understanding and beginning to realize the role my ego plays and has played in my career, I found that really challenging at times because I could see that at points in my life and on projects in certain companies, the decisions I would make would be made out of self-interest and out of a sense of something I wanted to get. And I understand that the ego can be incredibly helpful. We all have an ego. Our egos help us through life. But our egos can also disrupt our lives and get in the way of thinking more positively. So for me, seeing my ego differently and actually realizing I had an ego, I'd never read a book about egos. And it was really eye-opening to me and challenging to me to have to understand, so what's the role my ego has played in business? And understanding that now, how would I do business differently? It was a really deep reflection on the role of my ego in my life and in my career and how I'd like to do things differently going forward. And doing things differently for me means doing everything with authenticity. And that's not just a word, it's every part of me is in alignment with truth. So authenticity to me is being open, being honest, being vulnerable, being willing to share things that are maybe not as comfortable as I would normally share. So to me, everybody I interact with now in consulting, and not just in consulting, but everybody I interact with now, I engage completely. I'm fully present. I listen carefully and respectfully, and I do my best to understand every perspective around a table. And I don't jump to conclusions. I don't judge the way I used to judge. I used to be quicker to judge people without reason. But now I've really learned to be more authentic. In business, I've found being more authentic equates to more success. People want to interact with somebody who's honest and authentic, not with somebody who is trying to get something done and trying to achieve something that isn't in alignment with what's required. So for me, it's really my business approach now is based on authenticity. The things you measure in consulting are simple. Do you have enough work to deliver? Is your team meeting their billable targets? Are you generating revenue? Are you generating more revenue than your costs? Are you meeting a profit margin target that you might have? These are not difficult things to measure. It's what you do with your team and how you inspire and engage your team that gets you to those numbers. For me, it's not a conscious, everybody has to hit their billable target this week. No, it's everybody has to really engage on the project, work with the clients, work with the team, let's get to the solutions, and let's do something really interesting here. Let's go beyond what's necessary, and let's add something that is really valuable to the client, to the regulators, to the stakeholders. Let's go beyond just what's needed. One thing I've observed and learned is there are some really good companies out there to work in. And there are some companies that aren't as positive to work in. I'm sure they're changing. I'm sure they're getting better every day. So when an individual, if you're looking at where you should be in consulting, if you feel safe, if you feel like you can talk to your managers, directors, colleagues without fear, if you can be honest and authentic, I expect you're in a good workplace. If you don't feel like you can speak openly, if you feel like you're working on projects that really aren't contributing anything positive or meaningful to a community or a society or to the environment, it might be time to think about where you're working and whether you're in the right place. One of the lessons then is looking carefully at yourself and seeing how your own values line up with the values of the place you're working. I also plan to, through 2023, advise companies, spend time with companies that are interested in evolving and becoming more enlightened in their practices and the way they operate. So I will be, in 2023, doing some coaching with individual firms, with individual consultants, and speaking around the world about the book I've written.